All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I left us off last time kind of talking about the challenges for the CSI Church. Just wanted to put this up here again. I'm not going to necessarily go into it all, but I do want to highlight this, like the dichotomy between social justice and evangelism. I want to highlight that tension because that tension we will see reproduced in the North American church as well, in what becomes the split between the mainline Protestant church, and I'll explain all of this as we go on, the mainline Protestant church and evangelical Protestant churches. Another big thing that has resonance for North America is theological modernism. It's a certain approach to interpreting the Bible from the lens of science and secular reason, and also multi-ethnicity, because there's a lot of ethnic history that impacts the development of the church in North America. And I also wanted to just remind us about the theological vision behind the CSI Church that I think we will need to recover to be effective here in North America. And by the end of this presentation, I like, as I'm showing you what has happened in the North American church and how that has led to where we are today, I'm hoping that you'll be even more convinced that this vision is appropriate for us here. And basically, the vision is one for visible reunion of the church, not just cooperation among different churches, not just federation among different churches, but visible reunion as a means of showing the world, testifying to the world, the truth of the gospel in a community. Like, we're coming to a time where the only credible argument to society that doesn't understand Christian claims, and in some cases sees Christianity as regressive or primitive or even harmful to society, the only convincing argument will be a beautiful community that actually lives the gospel and believes in it. And so that's, you know, kind of where I'm going with all of this by the end of the presentation. So just want you to like file that away in the back of your mind as we're going through. Okay, so we've had a lot of classes, and I know it's been a lot of information. So I just want to kind of, at the outset, give you a reminder, a recap of everything that has gone so far really quickly. So the church starts in Jerusalem, it's persecuted, it scatters to Samaria, Ethiopia, Syria. Specifically in Syria, in Antioch, Antioch's a very cosmopolitan city. It speaks Greek and it speaks Syriac. And so from Antioch, the church spreads west to Greco-Roman society. We read about that in Acts with the missionary journeys of Paul. And the church spreads east to the more Syriac speaking type areas. So it spreads to Arabia, it spreads to Persia, and eventually it spreads to India as well. By the 300s AD, Christianity has basically conquered the Roman Empire, not with a war, but honestly by dying, it has conquered the Roman Empire. Through the witness of the martyrs, it has conquered the Roman Empire. And there's a period in which you have like about 300 years where the Roman world is basically Christian, and the Eastern world, the area we think of as the Eastern world, like Persia, Arabia, even southern India, is becoming increasingly Christian. But then in the 600s AD, we have the rise, it's like a phenomenal meteoric rise of Islam, starting in this small corner of the Arabian Peninsula under the leadership of Muhammad, and spreading and conquering with a sword the Persian Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, much of the Middle East, and North Africa as well. North Africa, which had been a great cultural Christian leader in a lot of Christian theology and philosophy. So, you know, great Christian leaders like the Egyptian Athanasius or the North African Augustine. They came from North Africa. Well, that entire civilization is basically taken over by the Muslim conquest in about 100 years. In the meantime, the Roman Empire had kind of collapsed in the West. And so you kind of have this period in history where Christianity, if you were like an alien looking at world civilizations, you would think that Christianity was about to die out, right? There's like a little pocket in India that's surviving. Persia and, you know, the Arabian Christians and the Syrian Christians in the Middle East, the North African Christians, they've basically been conquered. Many of them converted to Islam. If they didn't convert, they were basically kept in small little ghettos where they could continue to be Christian, but they had to pay a special tax to the Muslim rulers. And then you have like France, Italy, Greece, basically Christian, but very pressured from the north, from pagan Germans and Vikings, and from the south, from the Muslims who have now conquered Spain, right? And so, and also from the east, because they're in Turkey and now starting to take over Greece. And so like Christianity is in this like little pressure cooker, right? It's hemmed in from the north, east, and south. To the west is obviously the ocean. And somehow Christianity is able to survive and even Christianize the entire continent. It's this amazing story over the course of 1,000 years, right? Under the leadership of the Catholic Church, Christianity spreads from the Roman world to Germany, to England, to Scandinavia, to places like Poland, Russia, and but it's still hemmed in, right? Like now it's spread northward, but it's still hemmed in by the Muslim world. It can't reach the other parts of the world. And this leads to this tremendous pressure, a Christianizing pressure within the continent that leads to things like the Reformation, and then eventually also the Age of Exploration and the Enlightenment. So we talked a lot about the Reformation. I want to talk a little bit about the Age of Exploration and the Enlightenment. Because European civilization felt hemmed in by the Muslim world, there was this, and also the Muslim world was technologically more advanced than Europe for much of this time. There was this like big pressure to somehow protect themselves from Muslim invasion, and also like kind of like rediscover the glories of like the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire. There was like a lot of shame, I guess, in feeling like they were not as technologically advanced, as scientifically advanced as their Muslim neighbors. And so eventually this led to, in the 1400s, the need to like break out of Europe, right? And so that's why they start sending all these expeditions west and south, trying to find trade routes to Asia that don't rely on the Muslims. That's basically what the Age of Exploration is. You know, Isabella and Ferdinand kick the Muslims out of Spain. Immediately after, they find Christopher Columbus and tell him to, you know, sail west, find a trade route to Asia that is not reliant on the Muslims. It's that kind of thing that's happening. At the same time, you also have the rise by the end of the 1700s of something called the Enlightenment, which is going to be very important as well. And basically, the Enlightenment is sort of taking from the scientific revolutions that have been happening and starting to apply it to philosophy and religion as well. So in the 1500s and 1600s, scientists had basically said, when we try to investigate the world, we should bracket out. We should not consider things like what a thing is for, like the purpose of a thing, because that brings in too much moral reasoning. And because of the Reformation, because of you know, the wars of religion, all those kinds of things, we don't want to necessarily like have to figure all that stuff out. We just want to focus very narrowly on the question of cause and effect, right? And so this is how you start to get things like scientific experimentation, more rigorous scientific theories that can be empirically proven, that kind of stuff. And so the Enlightenment is looking at that and seeing the tremendous technological successes of the scientific revolution and saying, let's start to take that same mindset and apply it to philosophy. So, into things like theology. So it's a way of de-supernaturalizing and demoralizing, especially Christianity. We're not necessarily like, let's look at the Bible, let's look at Christian truth claims, which have been the foundation for our culture so far, but let's look at it with a skeptical, critical, rational eye to see if, you know, these Christian claims can meet the bar of our, you know, human secular reason. So that's kind of the turn of the Enlightenment. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but that turn led to, already in the 1700s, a great loss of confidence in Christian claims, because now certain Christian claims began to seem more and more irrational, right? Like the miracles of Jesus, that's irrational. The virgin birth of Christ, that's irrational. The resurrection of Christ, that's irrational. Jesus Christ as the Son of God, the Trinity, these are all like things that don't make rational sense, according to like Enlightenment thinkers. And so that also affects the story of how Christianity spreads in North America. So I was talking about the Age of Exploration and Enlightenment because that's going to really affect how Christianity grows and spreads in North America. And eventually that's going to lead to the problems with Christianity in North America too. So very quickly, the like initial spread of Christianity in North America, John Cabot landed in Newfoundland, I think I'm saying that right, in 1495. This is before the Reformation. So he was, you know, journeying for king and for church, and the church back then, even for England, was Roman Catholicism. So he brings with him the Catholic faith to what is now Canada. After King Henry VIII, obviously the Church of England was formed. So much of British North America, including what is now Canada, was Anglican. French North America, which was also kind of like what is now Quebec and other parts of Canada, was Roman Catholic. But to be honest, the impetus in that northern part of North America, in Canada, was more economic. It wasn't like as religiously motivated as some of the American colonies. The Canadian explorers were more interested in, you know, timber and fur trade with Native Americans, and especially finding a northwest passage to Asia that they could, you know, instead of having to travel all the way around Africa or travel through like around the end of South America, maybe there's a northwest passage to get to Asia. That's what they were interested in. The American colonies were a little different. You did have Anglicans, especially in the South, that were more focused on like economics and trade and you know, building plantations, that kind of stuff, like in Virginia or South Carolina, North Carolina. But especially in New England and Pennsylvania and even New York too, there were more attempts to create utopian societies, right? So we talked about, when we were talking about Christianity in England many months ago, we had talked about how there's the Church of England, which is the established church, but then there are all these like non-conformist churches, right? There are the Puritans or the Congregationalists, the Quakers, there are the Baptists, there are the Methodists, there are the Presbyterians. And each of those groups were interested in coming to colonial America in order to create ideal societies where they could form their own state, basically, that followed their religious traditions instead of having to be a minority in Anglican England, right? So that was a big motivator for many of the early colonists. You did have other folks too, like Roman Catholics, Jews, even Muslims, but they were a very small minority early on. in North American religion. So I want to give you kind of an overview of who the important players are in terms of churches as this age of exploration is happening, and now settlers are coming to the North American continent, especially among the establishment types, the elite. It was the Anglicans, what is now the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church of Canada. You also had the Congregationalists coming, especially to New England, right? And they eventually today would be known as the United Church of Christ. There's a group of Congregationalists who became convinced that infant baptism was wrong and you have to do adult baptism. Those folks became the Baptists. You had the Methodists, which we talked about John and Charles Wesley earlier. As Methodism migrates westward, right, through like westward expansion, especially in the United States, Manifest Destiny, those kinds of things, the churches become a lot looser in their, like, they were founded by Methodists, but they don't necessarily stay Methodist. They start becoming holiness churches. And finally, by the time you reach California in the 1900s, that's the birth of the Pentecostals from what was originally a Methodist movement. You have the Presbyterians. As you have immigration, then you start to have more Roman Catholics, especially in the United States, from the Irish and Italian populations. You have Lutherans coming in with the Germans. If you go to Michigan, you see all of these like Dutch names everywhere. That's because of the Dutch Reformed that really like settled in Michigan and in parts of the Northwest, like Illinois. In Canada, it's a little different. So in the United States, you still have like the Southern Baptists, right? You have the United Methodist Church. You have the Presbyterian Church of the United States, those kinds of things. In Canada, influenced by the ecumenical movement that led to the formation of CSI too, the Congregationalists, Methodists, and Presbyterians joined together to form the United Church of Canada. The difference is they didn't join with the Anglican Church of Canada, right? Like, whereas in India, the Anglicans joined too, in Canada, the Anglicans didn't join. So that's like that's a distinctive difference in Canada. Okay. So I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but I'm hoping you'll start to see how all of this like flows together. The big thing to realize about religion in North America is that's different from Europe, is that because there's not established state religions, religion becomes more and more a marketplace where the individual gets to choose what Christian tradition they align with. So, in Germany, you were probably a Lutheran because your prince was a Lutheran, right? In England, you were an Anglican. You had these like weird non-conformist groups, but if you're just a normal English person, you were an Anglican. If you were in Scotland, you'd be a Presbyterian. If you're in France, Spain, Italy, you're a Roman Catholic. So it's more like I'm a member of this people, and this people belongs to this, stream of Christianity. In North America, it starts to become very different because you have this early attempt among the like Puritan colonists and stuff like that to create these like Christian utopias. But as the Enlightenment happens in Europe and spreads to North America, the children and grandchildren of those early like religious enthusiasts basically secularize, right? Like they become, Benjamin Franklin, great example. Like his grandfather was, I think, like a minister, a very like strong minister, but he becomes a deist. Why? Because he's influenced by the idea of the Enlightenment, the idea that religion needs to be critiqued by secular reason, and so therefore should be kind of viewed a little bit suspiciously. So you have a lot of, especially early American founders who were deists, people who believe that there may be a God, but God is not involved in the day-to-day workings of the world, right? That would be kind of a silly thing for God to do. There may have been a Jesus, like Thomas Jefferson believed there was a Jesus. He was probably a great man, but the Bible has a lot of things that are not true. So, Jefferson famously had a Bible where he crossed out all the things that he thought were ridiculous in the New Testament so that he would just have like the true sayings of Christ. And how did he determine what was, true and not true? It's whatever seemed reasonable to him. He was using his reason, his rational reason. These miracles probably didn't happen, but Jesus probably said stuff like the Sermon on the Mount, that kind of stuff. So as these utopias prove unsuccessful, the religious traditions remain, but now they become viewed as, it's really in America that the idea of denominations take off, that you're all Christian, but you can join this denomination instead of that denomination, depending on what you're convinced of, right? And this is bolstered by the Great Awakenings. So we talked about John Charles Wesley. Other people you may hear of when you study the Great Awakenings are preachers like George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards. These are people who emphasized that the idea of a religious experience, a strong religious experience as necessary for real Christianity. And the reason this was appealing and powerful and contributed to more people kind of turning back to Christianity in the 1700s and 1800s is that experience is a place that secular reason can't necessarily critique as strongly, right? There's this idea that, well, I feel this, I have this strong feeling, this strong religious awakening happening, and you can try and reason with me or critique it on rational grounds, but it doesn't necessarily shake my belief in my experience. And so that's part of the reason why revivalism and strong religious experience led to a kind of renewal of Christianity in North America, but it also moved North American Christianity in a particular experiential direction. So you have all these different denominations competing with one another. You have this emphasis on individual religious experience in order to defend my religious faith against the critique of Enlightenment reason. And that's how this marketplace approach to Christian religion really took off in North America. And the reason why this is important is this explains why Christianity was more successful in North America, because at the end of the day, people felt it aligned with the individualism of especially American culture, this idea that I can choose. It doesn't matter what people I was born to, I can choose what I believe on the basis of my experience and my reason. And so Christianity was more robust in certain ways in North America than in other places in Europe. But at the same time, it also shaped how Christianity evolved in North America, because when you have a marketplace approach, you start to cater to what people are buying. Do you know what I'm saying? You don't emphasize making sure everyone, if you're Presbyterian, you don't emphasize as much making sure everyone memorizes the Westminster Confession. And you don't try and keep everyone so accountable to the Westminster Confession, right? Because if you're too hard on that, people are just going to be like, oh, I'm just going to go to the Methodist church across the street, right? So there's a dilution in these very strong, so there's this growth of denominations, but also the differences between the denominations don't matter as much because they're all trying to cater to the lowest common denominator in order to get mass appeal. And so this marketplace approach means that Christianity has a new lease on life in North America, but now it's also very, very different. It's not as interested in doctrinal questions or theology. It's very willing to adapt to whatever the populace is thinking or feeling. Okay. So in that situation, who won the marketplace in North America? Among the elite, it was still the Anglicans and the Presbyterians. You can see that in the theological colleges, like Princeton College is a Presbyterian college, it's founded as a Presbyterian college, still, churns out a good chunk of Presbyterian ministers even today. If you look at the presidents of the United States, many of them were either Presbyterian or Episcopalian. If you look at the prime ministers of Canada, I think until Trudeau, almost all of them were, the first Trudeau, I think almost all of them were Anglican. So, you know, among the elite, it's the Anglicans and Presbyterians, but among the common people, it's the Methodists and the Congregationalists in Canada. In the United States, the Methodists and the Baptists, right? And why? It's because they were the people who emphasized this idea of revivalism, of strong religious experience. And they also emphasized this idea of like individualism, personal choice. And for the Baptists, obviously, that's represented most starkly in the idea that I make a personal choice and then I am baptized, right? Adult baptism. So remember that, so something to keep in mind is at the end of the day, when you have this marketplace and experience approach to Christianity, the final authority is not really tradition and it's not really scripture, or it's not, it's the individual. It's the individual's experience. I get to choose what I really believe. Because at the end of the day, if I disagree with what is happening in this denomination or this church, I can leave and I can either start my own thing or I can join this other thing that's happening. Another really important thing that impacted the history of, the history of Christianity in the United States, because in Canada, obviously slavery was abolished when the British Empire abolished slavery in 1834. But in the United States, it was a little different because we had to fight a civil war. The common person was Baptist or Methodist, and that meant that the slaves were reared in Baptist or Methodist churches. And as the United States began to have more free Black people, that led to a lot of tension in how exactly to treat African-American churches and African-American people. So you had, early attempts, like even in the late 1700s, Charles Wesley and John Wesley were both ardent abolitionists, right? Like they did not support slavery in England. And also, they tried to convince the North Americans of that too, but in America, that was the big point of tension with John and Charles Wesley from the American Methodists, is that they wanted to keep slavery and they didn't like their critiques of slavery. But because of the Wesleys' influence, they did start ordaining free African-American ministers, but they kept the church services segregated. And so Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were two early African-American leaders ordained by the Methodist Church. They protested against the segregated worship services, and they led Black Methodists out of the church to form what's called the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. The church that was attacked in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015 or 2016, that was an AME church, right? This is a very venerable institution in the Black church. There are also splits that happened within Methodism and within Baptist churches, like the white churches, on the question of slavery and segregation. So the Methodist Church split into two conferences because some Methodists were like, if you're a slaveholder, you should not be eligible for church office. And the Southern Methodists didn't like this, so they formed their own church. Eventually, they reunited in the 1930s. That's the formation of the United Methodist Church. That's why it's called United. They reunited. The Baptists had the same thing. The National Baptist Conference, there was a discussion, maybe we shouldn't have support slaveholders as missionaries around the world because they're slaveholders. The Southern Baptists didn't like this, so they formed the Southern Baptist Convention, which today is the largest Baptist group in the United States, still a very strong, probably the strongest evangelical institution in the United States is the Southern Baptist Convention. But that's its origins. It's, since then, obviously, it's elected an African-American leader, president of the convention. It's apologized for its origins in slavery, but that was its origin. It wanted to separate from the National Baptist group because it wanted to continue to support slavery. So that impacts the development, that further impacts the development of Christianity in North America. And also, like you can see how the marketplace mentality affects religion, right? Instead of being like, hey, let's go to the Bible and see what are the principles by which we can approach these questions of race and slavery and segregation. Instead, there's a strong feeling, right, that we want to protect slavery. And so the church accommodates that by either splitting off and forming a new church or by changing its own policies. And the same thing you can see when it comes to questions of science and faith that arise in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So around this time, start having Darwin's theory of evolution, questions about the age of the universe. The Lutherans in Germany were always the leaders in coming up with, they were always kind of at the cutting edge in historical scholarship of the Bible. That's like a tradition that really began with Martin Luther himself, who always wanted to go back to the original sources. But as that scholarship develops in Germany, it starts to, and as it's influenced by the Enlightenment, it starts to really question the historical reliability of the Bible. So it starts to question things like, was there really an Exodus, right? What historical evidence is there that slaves left Egypt? Those kinds of questions. How are we supposed to reconcile these different accounts? We have 4 different accounts of Jesus's life in the 4 Gospels. How do we reconcile that, and how do we reconstruct the historical Jesus, right? That was a big question for the Germans in the late 1800s. And so all that stuff eventually trickles through and starts affecting the United States and Canada as well. And that leads to in the 1920s to what's called the modernist fundamentalist controversy, right? So you start having this cleavage in American Protestantism. And see, this is again interesting. It's like, we don't necessarily care about whether you're a Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Baptist. We care whether you are a modernist or a fundamentalist, right? Like the denominations don't matter as much. We care how you are approaching these questions. So modernists are the ones who want to kind of reevaluate the Bible and Christian tradition in light of science and historical scholarship, the latest historical scholarship. Fundamentalists are those who want to basically fight back, reject any contributions or any attempts to try and reconcile science and faith. They see that as very threatening to key Christian doctrines, and so they don't want to even have that discussion. And this leads to splits within churches. Overall, in the early 20th century, the modernists won, right? Like the mainstream Christian churches all adopted the more modernist approach. So what are the mainstream Christian churches? Those are the churches that had the biggest percentage of population, of the American population and the Canadian population. In the United States, they're the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church of the United States, and the United Church of Christ. In Canada, they're the Anglican Church of Canada and the United Church of Canada. Those were the churches that in the early 20th century took the modernist turn, is what it's called. And they were very successful for the first 50 years of the 20th century. Around the same time, you have Catholics coming in. There's nothing I need to necessarily talk about with this. Catholics had always been in North America with the French and the Spanish, right? But now with Irish and Italian immigration, they become a growing body. Now in the United States today, they are the largest percentage of Christians. It's the same in Canada. The largest percentage of Christians are Roman Catholic. There's a lot of persecution against them initially. If you look at this picture I have here, you have, the strong Protestant minister protecting the children from the alligators that are crossing the sea. What are those alligators? They're Catholics. So, there's a lot of bigotry against Catholics, but eventually they were accepted by the middle of the 20th century, signified in John F. Kennedy, who was the first Catholic president. Biden is actually the second Catholic president of the United States. And as they became more assimilated in society, what's interesting is when you read Roman Catholics, they'll say it was by being introduced to America that a lot of Catholicism ended up being Protestantized as well. As they started seeking like mainstream acceptance, they started sort of reforming some of their practices in more Protestant directions. And I think this is most seen in Vatican II, which is a totally different conversation. Probably don't have time for that right now. So, but just kind of keep that in mind. Like it's not just Catholics came to America, it's also America changed Catholicism too, because of the marketplace approach, right? Like nothing escapes that. 1906, that's when we start seeing the rise of Pentecostalism. So you had William Seymour, who's from the African-American holiness tradition. He's a child of former slaves. He moves to California. He leads a 5-week Bible study in Los Angeles on the speaking of tongues as a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. And as he's preaching on it, he begins to speak in tongues. The people there start to speak in tongues. All around California, word begins to spread. Hey, there's this, Black preacher, and he's teaching about tongues, and people start speaking in tongues. It's crazy. Come check it out. And so people from all kinds of racial backgrounds begin to flock to hear Seymour speak. Over the course of, like, I think 10 or 20 years, I forgot what I was reading, thousands of people end up kind of like cycling through Seymour's home. I mean, Seymour never ended up being like a rich guy or anything, but he ends up becoming extremely influential because all these people cycled through to hear him speak and to receive the gift of tongues from him. And then they take it back to their communities all across the United States. And then from the United States, they spread around the world. And with them, they bring the Pentecostal movement. So some Pentecostal churches, they're all Pentecostal denominations, all tend to be Wesleyan or Methodist in origin. I mean, Seymour himself from a holiness tradition was Methodist in origin as well. So those denominations are the Church of God in Christ, the Assemblies of God. If you've heard of those churches, I mean, they're in India as well, they're in Kerala as well. That's what many Pentecostals belong to. Okay, so you have the modernist fundamentalist controversy we were talking about earlier. By the 1940s and 1950s, after World War II, the fundamentalists start to see that they have not been successful in influencing the church in North America. And so they start to kind of move towards the mainstream of society. They start to, before the fundamentalists had basically kind of like withdrawn from American society, they weren't really engaging. They weren't trying to convince people of anything. They were more just kind of huddled in their own little communities. But starting with Billy Graham, that's a picture of Billy Graham. Starting with Billy Graham, you see that begin to change. And that's when fundamentalists begin to adopt the term evangelicals, right? And David Bevington has a mark, has written a lot on what makes someone an evangelical. What are the belief systems that distinguish evangelicalism from mainline Protestant Christianity? And it's really 4 things. And it's interesting, again, these are not, the old Reformation categories of division, right? Like Lutherans versus Calvinists versus Anglicans versus Methodists versus, all those different things. That's not necessarily front of mind anymore, right? Because again, we're in this marketplace. And so the things that are distinguishing for evangelicals are a belief in conversionism. So there needs to be a moment, a decision was taken for Christ, for following Christ, a belief in activism, that faith is not just intellectual, but it influences how you live, and especially places upon you an obligation to share your faith. Biblicism, which is belief in the inerrant truth of the Bible, and crucicentrism, which means a focus, when sharing the gospel, a focus on the saving work of Jesus on the cross for you, right? Again, for you, like that individualist, personal kind of emphasis. So those are the marks of evangelicalism. And up until the 1950s, the church had mainly been mainline. The Protestant church in America had mainly been mainline. After the 1950s, you see the growth of evangelicalism and the decline of the mainline in Protestant Christianity. Part of that is due to what ends up happening in the 1960s, and the way in which the mainline church responded to what was happening in the 1960s. So in saying all of this, I'm not necessarily saying, I have my opinions, but I'm not telling you whether these things are good or bad. I'm just saying this is what happened, right? So in the 1960s, you had the contraceptive pill, which revolutionized sex and gender relations. You had arguments before on like defending things like premarital sex or, more radical feminist movements, sort of women's liberation type movements, that kind of stuff. But it wasn't practical because at the end of the day, if you had sex, it was very likely that eventually the woman would be pregnant and you would need to take care of the child and make provision for the child, that kind of stuff. The pill really changes all of that, right? It changes the tight connection between sex and pregnancy. Abortion laws are liberalizing. Martin Luther King has very strident and strong calls to end racial segregation and racial discrimination against African Americans in the United States. There's a new questioning of America's role in the world from a religious perspective. What I mean by that is that, especially among the mainline, there was more of a critique, whereas before the mainline had been very supportive of the United States, for example, engaging in World War II. Now we're fighting in Vietnam, and a lot of those mainline ministers are questioning America's role in fighting in Vietnam, like why are we there, those kinds of things. And there's also a liberalization of pornography and obscenity laws. So whereas that stuff had been very tightly censored before the 1960s, now it's a lot more available. And so you get into this period and it's very chaotic. And so people start reacting to it. And again, the church is a marketplace. So the church is adapting and figuring out how to adapt and how to respond to this very chaotic period in the 1960s. And what ends up happening is you have kind of a polarization, right? Where the evangelicals basically become the place for more conservative people to flock to, and the mainline becomes the place where more liberal people flock to. And that leads in the 1970s to the rise of the religious right. So Jerry Falwell is widely credited correctly for being behind the rise of the religious right. The religious right is basically this idea that evangelical Christians need to be involved in the political decision-making, especially of the United States. What motivated Falwell to start organizing churches in this way was there was a Supreme Court case, Bob Jones University, where the tax-exempt status of the college was taken away because it discriminated against Blacks in admissions. Falwell also said these are all things Falwell has said motivated him in forming the moral majority. I'm not just like guessing, he's actually said this, right? So it's also Roe v. Wade, the legalization of abortion, especially in the first and second trimester in the United States. Homosexuality has always existed, right? But now it's more in your face, more confident in some ways. And so he's responding to that. The teaching of evolution in textbooks, more obscenity, pornography in the culture. So Falwell is responding to all of that, and he's able to inspire a lot of evangelicals to get more involved in politics. So not just think in terms of evangelism like Billy Graham was, but also get involved in the political sphere. The first election where they really did that was 1976, where the evangelicals supported Jimmy Carter. But after Carter, they kind of switched their allegiance to the Republican Party in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Also in the 1980s, so it's kind of like the swirl of stuff is happening in the United States, and it's like more and more the church is again not investigating first principles, not necessarily turning to like the Bible or the gospel in order to say how it can respond to culture faithfully, but more there's this pressure in this like marketplace to keep people, right? And so you're going to adapt whatever you're doing in order to like keep as much of a market share as you can. And so it's in that kind of mindset that you can also understand the 1980s Word of Faith movement. So if you've heard of Lakewood Church, Joel Osteen in Houston, the Prosperity Gospel, that's all very aligned with like this Word of Faith movement, which it existed before, but really took off in the 1980s. It has its roots in the teaching of E.W. Kenyon, who basically combined Pentecostal teaching with positive thinking psychology. Word of Faith stuff basically says, if you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth certain things about your future, it will become true. So if I have the right spirit-filled, belief-filled confession, which means like statement that I say out loud, then I can receive blessings from God. So, I wake up in the morning and I say, God will make me healthy and I will be healthy. God will give me money. I will get money. God will find me a wife. God will find me a wife. God will heal me. God will heal me. So it's that kind of stuff. That's, yeah. I think people are mostly familiar with this. And again, the swirl of stuff means like I'm giving you the categories, but everything influences everything else. So, a popular preacher right now is a guy named Stephen Furtick. He's not a Word of Faith preacher, but he does a lot of the Word of Faith stuff because even though he's not part of this movement, he's been influenced by this movement. So as I said before, latter half of the 20th century, the main line is declining. I kind of want to show you how we can see that happening. In 1970, 30% of Americans were mainline Protestant. 2015, that's dropped to 15%. 20% of Canadians in 1991 were mainline Protestant. 2011, 10% were. Why was that? Well, on the one hand, the mainline church saw social, like when it understood God's mission in the world, there came this like huge dichotomy, right? Like we talked about this in the CSI context as well, right? Whereas the evangelical said God's mission in the world is about evangelism, converting people, the mainline church said God's mission in the world is social justice, fighting for civil rights, fighting for women's rights, fighting for the liberation of people. And those things got separated. The mainline church was also, because it was influenced by the modernist controversy. I don't want to say that the mainline church like rejected the divinity of Christ or anything like that, because that's not true. The mainline church is a lot more diverse on those questions, but they didn't have, they were very unclear and ambiguous. And so people didn't really know what they believed. And people in attending the churches weren't always clear, like, what is the takeaway? I feel inspired to go fight for social justice, but what am I supposed to think about salvation, resurrection, things like that? Those questions weren't necessarily taught or explained to the people who were attending them. Even today, the mainline church exists, and it's tends to be more popular among people who are very educated, the graduate and postgraduate degree type folks, people who have a little bit more money. But I think the most convincing hypothesis on what happened to the mainline, why did it decline, is that frankly it won, right? Like its beliefs about how culture should be organized, how society should be organized, really kind of won the day in the United States and in Canada. And so, and it's not making these distinctive claims that are really in tension with where culture is headed in the United States or Canada. And so I think a lot of people started to think like, well, what's the point of going to this mainline church? That's kind of what the culture is. And so a lot of people, in a way, the mainline church was a victim of its own success. is kind of what I'm trying to say. It won in convincing the bulk of culture that what it believed about social justice and how society should be organized is true. But because it's unclear on these other doctrinal issues, people were convinced by them that those doctrinal issues don't really matter. In response to that, like the decline of the mainline, the rise of evangelicalism, also the rise of the prosperity gospel and things like that, in reaction to that, you have in the 2000s what's called the rise of the new Calvinists, right? So these are basically mostly Southern Baptists or people who are originally Southern Baptists, who have been really influenced by Calvin's ideas on salvation. So they're not Calvinists in the like old sense of like the 1600s, because they don't believe everything that the Reformed back then believed. But specifically when it comes to like the tulip doctrine, if you guys have ever heard of that, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints, that stuff they buy. Some ways in which they're different from traditional Calvinism, again, they're responding to like the marketplace, right? So maybe this is a cynical way of saying it, but I think in reality, that's what's going on. They believe in the continuationism of extraordinary spiritual gifts like healing. Calvin didn't believe in any of that. They hold to believers' baptism. You know, Calvin taught infant baptism. There's less emphasis on the sacraments. The sacraments were very important to Calvin. They're very influenced by the revivalists like the Puritan Jonathan Edwards. Examples of these types of folks are John Piper in Texas. There's a very popular pastor named Matt Chandler. Among the Southern Baptists, there's a professor named Al Mohler. These are kind of people who really popularized the new Calvinism. And so there are a lot of churches that call themselves non-denominational, right, today, but really their roots are in the new Calvinism. They tend to be Baptist in the way they understand church, and they're Calvinistic in terms of like tulip and how they understand salvation. So in reaction to that, and in reaction to the new Calvinism and evangelicalism and the religious right, you start having people who call themselves post-evangelicals, right? So this is more recent history, the 2010s. If you guys have heard of Rachel Held Evans or Rob Bell, these are all people who sort of like very publicly left evangelicalism, but still they're like, I'm a Jesus follower, but I don't know what I think about doctrine. I don't know what I think about scripture. I don't know what I think about church tradition. All that doesn't really matter, right? Like, I just love Jesus. Can we just all agree on loving Jesus? All that doctrine stuff doesn't matter. It's not a very big portion of North American Christianity, but it is very vocal. It's a vocal minority. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground, and I know it was all over the place, but I'm going to try and like give you a takeaway and why does this matter kind of conclusion. So when you look back at the mid-20th century, again, if you're an alien looking at North America, you would think that Christianity looked really, really strong after World War II. Right after World War II was the moment that it was the highest percentage of the American population, especially, that was actually attending church weekly. You look at the major branches of Christianity, and they all seemed very vital and strong. So evangelicalism after World War II, you have Billy Graham. In the main line, you have this very respected theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr. Even today, he's influenced people like, Barack Obama has said he's his favorite philosopher, that kind of thing. Roman Catholics, you see Fulton Sheen, Vatican II after World War II. In the Black church, you see the rise of folks like Martin Luther King. So the church looks very strong, in 1947, 1950. But 70 years later, right, in 2021, all four of those branches are divided and declining. Evangelicalism, it's It's declining, but not as rapidly as the other three. The Black church is declining. The mainline church is declining the most. The Roman Catholic Church is also declining. It's bolstered a little bit because of immigration from Latin America, but the long-term statistics all decline still. Pentecostalism and non-denominationalism are growing as a percentage of Christians, but they're part of a shrinking pie. They're not actually growing as a percentage of the population. The number of Americans and Canadians who profess no religious affiliation at all, that's the number that's growing the fastest. Even among the people who say, so a majority in the United States and in Canada still say they belong to a religious tradition, but actually attending church or belonging to a church body, that's all significantly down. So it kind of raises the question, well, what does that really mean? Like, you were baptized Roman Catholic 30 years ago, but you don't attend a church, you just go for weddings, Christmas, Easter. What exactly is your relationship to the church? That's kind of a question too. And the culture itself, I would argue, following people like Tim Keller or Leslie Newbegin, the culture itself in the West and in North America is moving in a post-Christian direction, just like Europe before it did, right? So what does that mean? It means that you can have the culture believes you can have some of the good things that Christianity brought, like the idea in the equality of all people. That's not a scientific thing, right? Like, that comes from a value, a conviction that everyone is created in the image of God and therefore needs to be afforded a certain amount of dignity, is the foundation for like what in the West becomes human rights, right? So we think we can have human rights, but we don't need to have the primitive baggage of Christianity. Like, we don't need to have the specific truth claims about miracles or virgin birth or salvation by Christ or any of those kinds of things. That's what it means to be like a post-Christian culture. You can have the benefits of the old Christian culture, but you don't need to believe in the truth claims of the Christian culture. So that's the state of North American Christianity. You see a kind of a weak church, a divided church, a faltering church. And the question is, what happened? How did that happen over the course of 70 years? I'd argue, like as I've been saying all along, the roots of it are in the marketplace approach to North American Christianity that was present from the very beginning. But I think some additional thoughts that are really good to keep in mind come from the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, who wrote a really great book called Bad Religion. And so he identifies these 5 factors. So first, political polarization, like I talked about, pulled evangelicals to the right and mainliners to the left. This really hurt the church's credibility in the broader culture, because now churches just seem to be tools in the culture war games, right? Sexual revolution means that the traditional biblical teachings on sex with respect to homosexuality or premarital sex or whatever now seem very regressive and perverse to a lot of people. They seem harmful to a lot of people. That also makes Christianity seem less credible. Same time, you have the era of decolonization and third world empowerment coming up after World War II. And that has given people the impression that because Christianity's roots are so heavily European, like we talked about earlier, and that's for historical reasons, that makes Christianity seem imperialistic, right? And if you want to reject racism, if you want to reject colonialism, you have to reject Christianity as well. So that's another factor. The fourth factor is that he identifies is the great wealth that happened over the course of the baby boomer generation, the folks who were born after World War II and who still, are running the country. Donald Trump was a boomer. Biden was a boomer, is a boomer. Those folks saw a huge growth in material prosperity. And Douthat kind of shows in the book, anytime that kind of prosperity hits a society, you see a decline in religious faith and a turn towards like consumption, materialism, that kind of thing. And then the fifth factor he identifies is that all the other four factors he talked about above had their biggest impact on the elite, on the more educated, on the wealthier classes. And the elite are the people who are the gatekeepers of the institutions that really shape culture. So like the media, the academy, colleges, universities, places that we get educated at. I would definitely say like that's true in my experience. I remember being a freshman going to UT, and I saw like a history of Christianity course, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And I went into it, and it was all about deconstructing the historical claims of Christianity, why the resurrection is false, why the Bible can't be relied upon, all those kinds of things. And so the gatekeepers of our culture are shaped in this direction. They're more influenced. They're the most impacted by the prior four factors Douthit was talking about. And so they're the ones that move the culture in a particular direction. So what do we do in response to that? And this is what Douthit identified. And I think the reason why I wanted to bring it up with all of you is because I think it really jives with a lot of the things we've been talking about and saying, and it also really jives with Leslie Newbegin's analysis of the culture and what to do about it as well. So Douthit identifies 4 ways in which Christianity might blossom in North America again. One is through the postmodern opportunity. Trying to figure out a way to explain this briefly. Basically, what we have seen in North American society, and I think you can see it even in like our parents and their participation in WhatsApp groups, is a total loss of faith in like what is true and what is not true, right? Like a total, confusion on what is real news and what is fake news, right? And this was anticipated earlier, starting in the 1960s, when the Enlightenment distinction between like facts and values started breaking down in the academy. But those kinds of like big philosophical ideas, they take time to filter down to like the common person, right? And so basically there's this idea of like, who knows what's true? Who determines what is true? Isn't the truth whatever we say it is? It's subjective, right? Like, and how are we to say, who am I to say what is right or wrong, right? So the fact value distinction is, you can't derive an ought from an is. Just by looking at the world, you can't tell anyone else, just because there are facts about the world doesn't mean that you can tell anyone else what they should do, because there is no such thing as like real objective truth in the end, especially in the moral sphere. So, there are only really preferences. There's no such thing as morality. Hitler wanted to kill the Jews. That was his preference. I have a very strong culturally conditioned preference that he not do that. And I may feel that as a member of my society so strongly that I will go to war with him to stop him from doing that. But at the end of the day, there is no objective right or wrong, right? We can't scientifically show that there is a right or wrong. They're just strongly held preferences. And so that has kind of filtered into our society now, to where people are very confused, and like the truth is whatever, in a sense, the truth is whatever you say it is. And I think people recognize that is wrong on some level, and they don't like that. They don't know how to talk back to it. So there's an opportunity here in that Christianity, by showing the gospel as public truth, with truth that is true for everyone, not just whatever your private opinions are. It's truth that is true for everyone. It can kind of reclaim that idea of like objective truth. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what he's trying to talk about with the postmodern opportunity. He also talks about the Benedict option. There's a famous book by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. It's basically arguing that the church needs to form a very strong counterculture internally, and that needs to have just as much emphasis, if not more emphasis, than outward mission. Like you need to, because we live in a post-Christian society where Christian claims cannot easily be understood, you need to spend a lot more intentional energy on teaching the faith, especially to your children. So that's kind of what the Benedict option is about. Evangelization from the global south, this is basically a very New Beginning theme. It's the idea that just like evangelists and missionaries came from the West to Africa and India and Asia, now Christianity has kind of flipped, where Europe and North America are where Christianity is declining. But if there is a Christian continent in the world, it's Africa. The majority of Africans are Christian. Christianity is growing in leaps and bounds in China. It's growing, it's always been, I mean, it's been in Latin America for a very long time, but Protestant evangelical Christianity is really taking off in Latin America in recent years. And so groups, Douthit is saying, the opportunity for Christianity to live in the United States and in Canada is if missionaries come from those societies to the West now. Because that combats this preconception that a lot of non-Christians in North America have, that Christianity is a white thing or a European thing. It really undercuts that prejudice when the person telling you about the gospel is from Nigeria, right? From a Nigerian background or something like that. And then finally, kind of responding to what Douthit was saying earlier about how times of prosperity tend to be bad for Christian faith. He kind of pessimistically says, since 2008 or even earlier from 2001 with the terrorist attack, we may be kind of out of the time of rapid economic growth, and we may be living in an age of more disappointment. Disappointment economically, disappointment racially, maybe disappointment sexually, and that disappointment may prompt people to start looking for a story that gives, I wrote meta-narrative there, but really what I mean is a story that helps them make sense of their lives and gives meaning for their lives. And in order for us to be that kind of community, Douthit suggests that churches should be political in the sense of like caring about what's going on in the world, caring about social justice without being partisan. They need to be confessional but ecumenical. So that basically means like, instead of adapting to the culture, whatever your church teaches, like be confident in your church's history and in its teachings, but also don't be insular, because that won't necessarily speak to Americans who are very used to individual choice and being able to hop from whatever church they want. You have to kind of show an open hand and be willing to work with churches from different traditions, even as you are confident in your own history and in your own doctrine. And then finally, you have to find ways to capture people's imagination. Like there's this old quote, I think it's from G.K. Chesterton, make good men wish that Christianity were true and then show them that it is so. But that's the kind of evangelistic, apologetic approach that we need to take. Show the goodness of Christianity, how it leads to health in people's lives and in society. I know that was a lot. Before I open up to questions, I kind of want to tie things together from everything we've been talking about in this class and in the previous historical classes. I think, you know, everything Douthit says, I'm convinced is true, but I've been kind of like, that book, that Douthit book, I think came out in like 2012 or something. And I read it way back when. And I've been like marinating on these themes for like 7 years while trying to, you know, work in the CSI community. And what I've learned or what I've discovered is like, if you try and look at all of those things, that is way too big for our small community to focus on all that, right? Like that's way too daunting. But I do agree, ultimately, like the church, as the entire church in North America, should be working on all of those things. But there's a question for us, like, what do we, as this small group of, you know, leaders in the youth movement, leaders in our churches, what do we focus on? And again, I want to return to that point I made at the very beginning. The post-Christian turn in our societies means that we're coming back to the time, like in the early Roman times, when people are convinced by Christianity, not necessarily by, not by these like high philosophical arguments, but just by being exposed to a community that really believes the gospel is true and lives according to it. So that in and of itself, the community that truly proclaims the gospel and truly lives in accordance with it, that is the most persuasive, the most credible thing to people who are interested in Christianity or curious about Christianity. And so our focus should be on building that community. And so part of that is resisting the marketplace approach to religion that is so pervasive in North American culture, where if my church, so we have to kind of consciously turn away from that as leaders in our own lives. This is the approach that says, if my church makes this decision that I disagree with, I leave, right? Or if my church is not meeting my needs, however I define my needs, I leave, right? Instead, it is returning to that older conception of the church as a people that has a claim on you just because God has given you to that people, right? That, I think that is so key in building up the kind of community that can withstand the constant accommodations and adaptations that North American Christianity has taken, which has really distorted the gospel message. So first step is just build the community. Just be present. Just be there. Just show up at church, be there, be kind of like there for people in the community as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is rooting the community in the gospel, right? Like, because it's not just enough to be the community. It also has to be a certain kind of community, a community that's rooted in the gospel. But that begs all sorts of questions like, what is the gospel? Because of the marketplace pressures on North American Christianity, the gospel was reduced in all kinds of ways to just a message about my personal destiny, my personal destination. It's a message about how do I get to heaven when I die? It's by believing in Jesus Christ. That is true, but that is a reduction of the gospel message, because the gospel message is not just a truth claim or good news about my religious experience or my personal salvation. It's a claim about cosmic history. The gospel is a claim that Jesus Christ is Lord of the world, and all of human history, all of the cosmos is headed towards a final consummation where God will be present to all. There's a judgment involved in that. But ultimately, it's a glorious, beautiful fulfillment of creation where pain and suffering and death are ripped out and destroyed finally. And the original intention of God for a perfect universe in which he's able to dwell and enjoy fellowship with his people, with humanity, is finally fulfilled. So it's a message about where history, all of history, is going. It's not just about my personal salvation or how I get to heaven when I die. We have to kind of rediscover that message. We also have to, I think, because of the entire marketplace pressures on Christianity, there was a tendency to kind of shunt to the side questions on how to understand the Bible as final authority. As Protestants, we all say that, but what does that really mean? We have to come to like a kind of common understanding of what that means for us as a community. How do we live in line with the Bible? And then finally, because of the marketplace pressures, there was a cheapening of grace. Basically, this idea that God loves you, doesn't really matter how you live. If you sin, just ask for forgiveness. It doesn't, and that has led to a lot of confusion on ethical questions. So coming to a better understanding of the relationship between grace and law, gospel and law, is something that's necessary too. And because I believe all that is the reason that I formed this leadership class to focus on those doctrinal questions going forward, right? So like the next few classes are going to focus on what does it mean for the Bible to be our final authority according to CSI doctrine, and how do we live in that today in North America. We're going to talk about what is the doctrine of salvation. We're going to talk about what is the doctrine of like the last things, like where does heaven, hell, you know, resurrection, how does that all fit in? The reason we're talking about all that is because I think as leaders, we need to really root the most important thing we can do to respond to everything that's happening in the culture is really root our local congregations in these truths. I know, you know, that's easier said than done. And many of us, you know, you may have an official church leadership position, you may not. That's fine. This is not about having official church leadership positions. This is just being convinced of these truths and offering them, bearing witness to them in our communities, because I think that's what's going to lead to transformation in the long haul. Yeah, and so that's the presentation. I know that was really long. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question.
Sure.
So I guess what's a way that we can like start doing that in our churches? Like, does it like we're doing obviously like leadership training right now, but could there possibly be something like leadership classes specifically when it like in the Bible and like being taught, I guess, how to relay this message to the church? Like, for example, I know like something like our church struggles with for the most part is like with Bible studies, right? It's really hard to conduct them because there's burnout. There's also like a general just like people not being prepared to lead them. And so what's a way we can build up, I guess, like that sort of lay leadership so that we can then go and communicate that message to the church?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So I've been thinking about that too. You know, the theme for the church, for the youth movement right now is like prayer, right? And so I've already been talking to the other youth leaders like Abhi and Shalawachan, our youth coordinator, on the theme for next year, like after conference, if conference happens in August, and that the theme should be Bible study and like specifically how to do Bible study. And so that's why these next few classes with all of you, what I want to show is like, what is the doctrine of scripture that we have? And then I also want to do like a case study on, okay, so like if that's our doctrine of scripture and that's how we are supposed to interpret scripture, I want to take that and then go to like a very relevant, I think, question, which is what do we think about homosexuality, right? Like, how do we evaluate? I think that's a question that a lot of people have that we're not really addressing in our church. So I kind of want to show you how that doctrine of scripture speaks to that specific issue. And hopefully through that, people will have more confidence in how to approach scripture. But yes, I agree with you. Like there needs to be also more training on how to lead Bible studies specifically. So I'll be thinking about that. And if any of you guys have any ideas, let me know. Part of what I want to do with this leadership class too, if we're able to keep it going after this first year, is like, so, you know, the next year, the youth movement would be focusing on Bible study. During that time, I would like to keep this class going for anyone who's interested in staying on and teach people how to preach like over the course of the year. And then the next year, like for what the youth movement would be focusing on is like proclaiming the gospel, preaching, that kind of stuff. So it's like every year this is kind of in my head, and I have to make sure the powers that be are cool with this too. But the idea is that the year before there would be a leadership class focusing on an issue. The year after, the youth movement as a whole would be looking at that issue and kind of implementing it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right, well, we will have our next class in March sometime. I'll send out a tentative date soon. Does anyone have like dates they want to throw out there that are like bad, that they definitely don't want to do? Just let me know. Okay, or you can text it on the group later on. For these next classes, as we're turning to the doctrine of scripture, I'm going to give you guys like some stuff you can look at beforehand. You don't have to, because I'll explain it during the class, but I think it will help you kind of understand things a lot better if you do take it a look. So I'll share some resources for you guys to look at before the next class as well. All right, y'all.